Chromosomes. Little strands of nucleic acids and proteins are the fundamental genetic instructions that tell us who we are at birth. Most people are born with 46 chromosomes, but each year in the United States, about 6,000 people are born with an extra chromosome, making them a person with Down syndrome. If you've ever encountered someone with Down syndrome, you know that they are some of the kindest, most joyful people you will ever meet. They truly have something extra. My name is Lisa Nichols, and I have spent the last 24 years as both the CEO of Technology Partners and as the mother to Allie. Allie has something extra in every sense of the word. I have been blessed to be by her side as she impacts everyone she meets. Through these two important roles as CEO and mother to Allie, I have witnessed countless life lessons that have fundamentally changed the way I look at the world. While you may not have an extra chromosome, every leader has something extra that defines who you are. Join me as I explore the something extra in leaders from all walks of life and discover how that difference in each of them has made a difference in their companies, their families, their communities, and in themselves. I am so excited today to have Rabbi Yonason Goldson on the show. Rabbi Goldson is a teacher, author, speaker, and seasoned world traveler. Rabbi Goldson, I am so excited to have you with me today. There is just so much that we can talk about. I'm sitting here thinking, how in the world are we going to get all of Rabbi Goldson in one podcast? So we may have to do a part 1 and part 2 with you because there's a lot of wisdom in your head. But thank you so much for making the time to be here. I know you're very busy.
It's my pleasure, Lisa. And, I already have enjoyed it enough to want to come back.
Well,
we haven't
good.
even started yet.
Awesome. I love to hear that. Well, let's just go on and get started. I want to talk a little bit about your origin story.
To make a very long story as short as possible, I went to the University of California where I graduated with a degree in English. And what does one do with a degree in English? I don't necessarily recommend doing what I did, which was to put on a backpack and start hitchhiking across the United States. And, there are a number of reasons. I felt that I was overly comfortable with my middle-class upbringing. And I also felt that I simply hadn't had the variety of experience that I needed to open my mind and expand my horizons. Mm-hmm. And after about half a year doing that, I crossed the Atlantic, went backpacking across Europe, until eventually I ended up in the land of Israel. And when I arrived there, I had this plan. I was going to find my way to an Israeli kibbutz, a collective farm, and volunteer for a couple of months and recharge my batteries, probably picking oranges or grapefruit, something like that. But very unusually, the dollar was at an all-time high that year. And there were millions of Americans in Europe. And when it got cold in Europe, they started draining into the Middle East. They ended up in Israel. And for the first time in anybody's memory, there were no places on kibbutzim. Simply couldn't find a place to volunteer.
Right.
And so through an unlikely series of events, I ended up in a rabbinic college and reconnected with my Jewish heritage, of which I knew virtually nothing. I'd been raised in a typical secular home, and discovered that this is where
you were supposed to be.
Exactly. And this
Wow.
is where truth was. This is where purpose was. This is where my identity was. Ended up staying in Israel for 9 years, studying, became a rabbi, met my wife, had our first 2 children. We left Israel. I started teaching high school Jewish studies. We taught for a year in Budapest, Hungary, 2 years in Atlanta, Georgia, and 20 years here in St. Louis.
My goodness, what a journey. Never did you imagine when you put that backpack on and you started hitchhiking, because you call yourself a hitchhiker, right, that it would lead you there. Isn't that amazing how you just followed your heart and you just went? And of course now, Rabbi, students all the time take what they call the gap year. And they do exactly what you did. So I think that was a very wise thing for you to do, when you didn't know for sure what you wanted to do.
I don't think my parents would have considered backpacking across the country wise. And certainly today, I wouldn't really recommend that. It's a much different world. But definitely breaking out of the expected course. And I think those of us who are older, many of us can look back, sometimes wonder, how did I get here? We often end up in places that we never imagined we would. And that can be a wonderful thing, because if life is too fixed, too planned out, we close ourselves off from options and opportunities that could really let us become the people we're meant to become.
I completely agree with that. I think probably a lot of our listening audience probably can identify with this because many of them start out one way and end up somewhere where they never thought they would be. But hopefully most of the time it's a better place when you can open yourself up to the possibilities.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be some sort of romantic or adventurous story. Interesting, in biblical Hebrew, there's no word for adventure. It's not a concept that we have.
Okay.
Doing something for the sake of doing something or for the sake of excitement, that's not really part of our culture. But challenging oneself to grow, to find new horizons, new opportunities, that's very much a part of what we believe.
Well, very good. Well, and then today you've done so many different things. You've authored books, you've been a columnist, you've been a teacher, you are a TEDx speaker, keynote speaker, you've done all kinds of things, but the thread typically has been around ethics, and you talk about ethical intelligence, ethical fluence. And one of the things that I was reading, Rabbi, is that, you say that the annual loss of productivity in the United States from unhealthy company cultures is estimated at $550 billion due to employee disengagement, $359 billion due to workplace conflict. So where can ethics help us change the trajectory on that?
Yeah, a fascinating study just last year by the Trust Edge Leadership Institute found when it asked employees what they wanted most from a job, the number one answer was a boss we can trust. And when you create a culture in which everybody feels that they're a valued member of the team, that their talents are recognized, that they get the support they need to be able to do their jobs properly, that they will be recognized and rewarded and appreciated for the effort and the productivity that they produce, and they share a common vision, and they sense that there's equity in that environment, people are willing to give their all. They want to be there. They want to be members of this team, part of this purpose. They share the vision, and they will give everything they can to being as productive as they possibly can. And they will, and they'll go home energized, and their home lives will be better. And so the work reinforces home reinforces work. All of it reinforces community.
Yes.
It's a win-win-win on every level. And on the other hand, when you have this sense of toxic competition or unfairness, it's terrible. It's destructive. It's corrosive. And people are looking to get out for any excuse not to do the work that they're there to do because they have no sense of fulfillment or satisfaction.
Do you have, because you speak all over the country, do you have stories? Do you have anything that you can pull out of a company or a leader that did that really well versus one that did not? I mean, some real life situations that you can talk about.
Absolutely. And in my keynote, I highlight two stories. One's personal, one is public. Paul O'Neill, who was later Secretary of Treasury under George W. Bush, he came on as the chair of Alcoa Aluminum in 1987, I believe. And the company was in crisis. Morale was down, profits were down, productivity, everything was down. And he announced the first day that his number one priority was to create a culture of workplace safety. And when he finished speaking, the people in the room, the investors, they literally stampeded out of there. One of them called his 20 biggest clients, and he said, "The board hired some crazy hippie. He's going to destroy the company." The next year, they had record profits. And from 1987 to 1999, when he retired, the productivity, the market value, the profits skyrocketed because the workers recognized that the man in charge was sincere and devoted, and he was going to create an environment where they were safe. They started contributing more. It's an absolutely phenomenal success story.
That is.
And personally, I worked here in St. Louis for 20 years teaching high school, and our principal, he was an extraordinary person in that he gave us everything we asked for if he could, always had our backs. We knew he was on our side. And then he left us alone to do our jobs. And in a tiny little school that had absolutely no academic admission standards, we consistently rated along with the top schools in St. Louis for test scores, admissions to universities. It was an incredibly successful program because he created this environment where we, the faculty, did our best work.
Yeah.
And he knew that the best way to serve the students was to create that kind of environment for the faculty. He was not a politician,
Right.
and he suffered for it.
Yeah.
He didn't fawn over the parents and the supporters,
Sure.
and that made his life difficult. But his number one priority was the academic environment. And he was incredibly successful when it came to that.
Great stories. Thank you so much for sharing those. So one of the things that you say, talking about trust, ethics creates trust. So someone that says, authentically, I am for you, I am going to create a safe place here, that creates trust. Trust promotes loyalty, which obviously happened at Alcoa, right? Loyalty generates passion. People are bringing their best selves to work in that case. And then passion drives productivity. So both of those stories just encapsulate, what you have said right there, I believe. Ethics creates trust. Trust promotes loyalty. Loyalty generates passion. Passion drives productivity.
And one of the misconceptions that I think we're all inclined to suffer from is that in this world we often have to choose between doing what's right and doing what's going to make us successful. If we buy into that, then we're always going to be flirting with unethical conduct, with personal self-interest. It's a tremendous fallacy because, as we've already talked about, when we live in an ethical environment, everybody feels connected and responsible for everybody else. In fact, I think so much of the problem comes from our focus on individual rights before we focus on individual responsibility. Because if I take responsibility for myself and I feel that I have a responsibility to look out for your rights and you have a responsibility to look out for my rights, then we're always going to be collaborating. We're always going to be working together. We're always going to be accommodating one another. But if I'm looking out for me and you're looking out for you, then we're always going to be at loggerheads. We're always going to be combative. And we're always going to feel the need, I have to get ahead at any cost. And that is what erodes the foundations of a civil society.
It's really kind of flip-flopping those. So it's really personal responsibility needs to be the first priority, right? Personal responsibility over personal rights.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's my personal responsibility to make sure that everything is a win-win. It's not just win for me, lose for you, right?
Yeah. And in Judaism, for instance, we have one of the fundamental principles in Jewish philosophy is not to mistreat animals. But if you see where that's gone to the extreme, I don't know whether it's still active, there used to be an actual movement to grant gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans civil rights.
Really?
This was
okay.
This was one of the big proponents of this was a fellow named Peter Singer, who was the head of the bioethics department at Princeton University. Now, some of us will say that's ludicrous. Others will say, well, why not? If they're intelligent creatures, then why should they not have the same kind of rights as human beings? The answer is that they don't have a sense of responsibility. Rights go hand in hand with responsibility. I have a duty to society.
Right.
I have an obligation to the people I share my world with. The law of the jungle is not the world of rights, and it can't be by definition.
Sure.
And animals are not capable of understanding that, and therefore they can't be held to any standard of responsibility. And that's why they don't have rights. We have a responsibility to them because they share our world. And we don't want to be cruel, and we don't want to take advantage of our greater power and our technology. And so it's a different way of looking at how we engage other people. Instead of what does the world owe me, what
Completely different mindset.
John F. Kennedy said this so beautifully, and it's on plaques and it's carved in walls, and we all know it.
I love where you're going.
But we forget. We forget. Yeah, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
But what you can do for your country.
But it only works if we trust the people around us have a similar mindset.
Very good.
Because otherwise we're back to nice guys finish last.
Yeah, right. Well, this is so fascinating. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with Rabbi Goldson. As a business leader, you know that keeping a solid first impression with your potential clients, customers, and talent is vital to reaching your organization's goals. If you haven't optimized your website, or if you don't even have a website, you're missing an opportunity to shape your first impression so that it shows your brand in the best possible light. If you're thinking about revolutionizing your website, let's talk. Our team at Technology Partners is ready to help you reshape your online presence. Go to tpi.co/websites and start your journey today. Welcome back. I was just thinking the very first time you and I spoke, we were talking about ethics, and we were talking about how can we as individuals always keep ourselves in check. And you gave me a question that I really believe is a great barometer and is possibly a question that we should be asking ourselves constantly before we say something, before we make a decision. What was that question?
If I could frame it for a moment before I give you the question. Part of the confusion that we have to deal with is the conflation of what's ethical and what's legal. Because many people don't have a sense, they say, if I haven't broken any laws, then what's the problem? So we have to understand that ethics governs the vast gray area between what's legal and what's illegal. Then the question is, how do I navigate that gray area? There's no app for this. It's something that we have to cultivate, a sensitivity we have to develop in ourselves. And the way to develop that sensitivity is whenever we find ourselves drifting into those kinds of gray areas, which can be often, I ask myself, what would the world be like if everyone did what I'm about to do? And if I can project and visualize a world where everyone is talking during the symphony or on their cell phone during the religious service, or borrowing supplies from the office, or leaving my unwashed coffee mug in the lunchroom sink. These are little things that we think it's no big deal. But an avalanche can be started by a few pebbles. And if we don't recognize that every little action we do contributes to the society and the culture and the community that we live in, then we really are complicit in the breakdown of ethical and moral values. And on the other hand, if we are aware that everything we do can be constructive and help reinforce society in a positive way, then we are part of the larger community of those who are creating a culture and ethical society that we all benefit from living in.
Okay, Rabbi, what really strikes me is you just gave a few examples, and they were small examples. Tell us if my ethics, my definition, and your definition are different. I mean, how can we come into the middle there?
Well, that's exactly the point, is if we start with little things and then we extrapolate outwards and we have this vision of how is my behavior going to affect the world around me. In my keynotes, the point I want to make is that you can't just open up a book or punch into your computer, is this an ethical choice or not?
Right.
Because there are too many variables. Ethics is a mindset. It's an attitude. It's a way of looking at the world. It goes back to that sense of I'm responsible, and my actions affect people around me, and that affects the culture that I live in, the community I live in, and I have to live in that. We have to sleep in our own
That's
bed.
right.
And if I don't make my bed, I'm not going to sleep comfortably. If I don't take responsibility for the influence and the impact I have on the community I live in, and the workplace I live in, and the family I'm part of. I mean, how many parents going to the amusement park will lie about a child's age to save a couple of bucks? And if we would ask ourselves, is it worth modeling dishonesty to my child to save $3?
Right.
$5? If we would look at these choices with any kind of objectivity, it's a no-brainer, but we don't.
Right.
We look at the moment. Oh, I've got a chance. I can get ahead. I can score a little win. And it's worth sacrificing my integrity and, more important, modeling that
For your child.
for my child, for the people around me. It's just a way of training ourselves to think. I want to think of myself as a good person. I want to be thought of as a good person. I want to influence people around me to want to be good people, because that's going to make my world better. That's going to make my business more successful.
Right. Right.
This is the point I want to communicate in my speeches, my talks, because it simply requires us to have a little bit more mental discipline in how we look at situations.
Yes, and I think you hit the nail on the head, that their mental discipline instead of just running ahead. So that is great. So you talk about the 3,000 years of wisdom. Why do you think the 3,000 years of wisdom, I want you to unpack that a little bit, is still relevant in today's world?
There's a folk tale in Jewish tradition of a fellow who's traveling from Jerusalem to Tiberias, and he gets to a crossroads. And there's one of the classic road signs, a signpost with the arrows pointing in different directions, except it's broken. It's lying on the ground. So there's an arrow telling him where Tiberias is, but it's not pointing up to the sky. Right?
Right.
But it doesn't take him long to figure out what to do. Right? He picks up the sign. He looks for the sign that points to Jerusalem. He knows he came from that direction. So he points the arrow that way, and then he can see where the arrow is pointing him to go forward to Tiberias. And the point is that if we know where we've come from, then we have a sense of where we're going. It's important to be forward-thinking. It's important to have progressive attitudes. It's important to want to improve on the past, but not to the point where we discard the past, not to the point where we forget the past, or as often happens, we rewrite the past to fit in with what we want it to be, which is profoundly dangerous. So the 3,000 years going back really to King Solomon, and even before King Solomon, the Bible says was the wisest man who ever lived. And he had a way of looking at the world and seeing lessons, seeing how nature, how history, how human relations and human nature teaches us what kind of people we're supposed to be. And he presented that in his book of Proverbs. So in one of my books, Proverbial Beauty, I take a number of excerpts from the book of Proverbs and I apply them to the modern world, because King Solomon's language is difficult for us. He wrote it 3,000 years ago.
Right?
But that doesn't mean forget about it. It means figure out how we can apply it to our circumstances and our times. And when we do, then we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to worry that our limited vision of our times is maybe out of step with the accumulated wisdom of the ages. No, we can blend it all together and we can go forward with confidence and have a deeper understanding of how we live. What are successful lives? Success in every word. Success in our relationships, in our vocations, our businesses, and in our communities and our society.
Well, very good. Well, so, Rabbi, what do you believe is the greatest challenge facing modern business today?
I think we already mentioned that we suffer from this misperception that we have to choose between being good and being successful. And short-term gains are very attractive. We have a crisis in instant gratification. We all talk about the dangers of our devices. We're on them compulsively. We are, in many cases, literally addicted to them. If you read the literature about the effect of dopamine, and we're simply seem incapable of detaching ourselves. And so we deprive ourselves of human interaction. I mean, this podcast is an unusual experience for me because we're sitting across the table looking at each other,
exactly,
as opposed to being separated by phone lines or computer lines. And it's a different dynamic. It creates an energy. It creates a warmth. And we suffer profoundly when we obsess about or when we fixate on these immediate short-term gains that are just like eating junk food. And we don't recognize how we're actually depriving ourselves of meaningful human interaction. And what comes out of that, that sense of connection. The irony is everybody's talking about connectivity.
Right.
And, I'm not the first person to point this out. The more we indulge this illusion of connectivity, the more disconnected we actually are. And that's why you've got rising suicide rates, particularly among young people, and dissatisfaction. And we lose that sense of community, which means we lose our sense of responsibility to each other, which means we lose our moral compass and our ethical values.
They say that this particular generation, the millennial generation, is the loneliest generation, yet they are the most connected in the way that social media and that sort of thing, connected that way, but not as much the face-to-face personal relationships, intimate relationships.
And it spreads beyond them. They're not the only ones suffering.
Sure.
We're all suffering because the way the culture goes, we all get carried along by the tide of the culture.
Wow, so much packed in there. Thank you so much for helping all of us today just think a little bit differently. So let's talk about something extra. Have you seen something extra missing in someone?
Yes. The previous job I had and the previous principal I had, he was always on the lookout for what was going wrong and how he could blame it on his faculty. And it created a combative environment in the school, one in which teachers felt unappreciated, felt that we had to always be looking over our shoulders, and when we were devoting so much mental energy that we didn't do our best work as teachers. And to tell you how bad it got and how far it went, I taught there for 2 years, and I was young and a little more overzealous than maybe I am now. I had the poor judgment of continuing to point out things that needed to be addressed that the principal didn't want to deal with. And one day, my wife got a call from a member of the board who said, "Where are you and your husband going?" And she said, "I don't know. Where are we going?" And this person said, "Well, the principal announced at the board meeting that the Goldsons won't be back next year because they've taken a position elsewhere." And my wife said, "Did he happen to say where it was? Because we don't know anything about it."
Right.
You know, it's sort of astonishing that a person could go to such lengths. But that's what happens when you lose that sense that we're a team and that we're working together and that we need to support one another and we're responsible to each other. And as we say in English, what goes around comes around. He was fired the next year, and I've heard through the grapevine that he never held a job after that.
Wow.
So when we talk
So
about
the
ethics,
personal responsibility was missing.
Yeah.
Was it not? Because that's what happens when people point fingers and blame. They're not taking responsibility for how they're showing up in the situation.
In my keynote, finger pointing is one of the 3 enemies of ethics that I cite.
Well, what do you believe is the something extra every leader needs?
Well, based on this model, I would say understanding humility. And I phrase it that way for a reason, because humility is another concept we misunderstand. Pastor Rick Warren has a beautiful quote. He said, "Humility doesn't mean thinking less of yourself, it means thinking of yourself less." And that just sums it up so beautifully. And of course, I find sources in the biblical tradition, and the Bible tells us that Moses was the most humble man who ever lived. And it also tells us that he was the greatest prophet who ever lived or would live. So I was trying to imagine Moses taking dictation from God. God says, "Take this down, Moses. You are the most humble man who ever lived." And he goes, "I am the most humble man who ever lived." And he was still the most humble man who ever lived after that. What is that humility? It's that as great as he was, he brought God's word to his people for all times. He brought down the tablets with the 10 Commandments, or the foundation of all our moral values. He never credited himself with being better than anyone else. He said, "If I've accomplished more, it's because I have been given gifts." I'm sure you know John C. Maxwell.
Oh, sure.
I heard him speak in Denver last month. He was asked about his accomplishments. He says, "I have a lot of talents. I have a lot of abilities. But they're gifts.
They all came from somewhere.
I didn't create those.
Sure.
They don't make me a better person than you or anybody else.
Right.
They make me more obligated to use them in a way that benefits others." And when I say understanding humility, it doesn't mean letting people walk over me. It doesn't mean denying who I am or what I can do. And I always, I'm not a big sports fan, but I always love it when in a baseball game you see these players, they hit a home run and they point their fingers up towards heaven. And for a while I thought they're saying, I'm number one or we're number one, but that's not what they mean. They mean look up. That's where talent comes from. That's where ability comes from. Thank you to the one who gave me the ability to do what I have done and to use the talents I have. And it's an expression of gratitude. I'm not the source. I'm merely a recipient, and that makes me responsible to use the gifts that I've received.
Yeah, I'm reminded of to whom much is given, much is required.
Exactly.
So when you've been given those gifts, I love what you just said. It's how you use those gifts. You have a responsibility then to use those gifts to make a difference.
And if I'm not, then I'm depriving the people around me of the positive contribution that I can make.
Right. In other words, step into it when you have been given those.
Absolutely.
Step into it. So, Rabbi, do you have anything coming up that you want to tell our listeners about that's exciting for you?
Well, not quite coming up, but still very relevant to me. I spoke in Colorado Springs last month at the TEDx conference there. It was an absolutely delightful and uplifting experience. A whole day of speakers and an audience that were all there because we share the idea we want to make the world a better place. So I would encourage the audience to take a look at my recent TEDx talk, which relates to many of the ideas, particularly how we can be ethical in the way we communicate with one another. And it's linked on my website. And they're also, they can find some of my books, and they can subscribe to my free newsletter.
So if they wanted to go to your website, what is that?
Well, they can spell my name, YonasonGoldson.com, and also my business name is EthicalImperatives.com. Either one of those will take them to the website, and always look forward to the opportunity to connect with people beyond this interview.
Very good. Well, Rabbi, thank you so much for being here. It has just been a joy to be with you, and I think I could sit here for another 5 hours and just listen to you and your wisdom. So thank you for being here.
It's been my pleasure.
Our show today is executive produced by Brian Muncie. Our technical producer is Daniel Williams. Something Extra with Lisa Nichols is a Technology Partners production. Copyright Technology Partners, Inc., 2019. For show notes or to reach out to Lisa, visit tpi.co/podcast. Don't forget to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you listen.